The afternoon sun beat down hard on the dry New Mexico desert in the summer of 1887. James McCarthy wiped the sweat from his forehead as he rode along the fence line of his small ranch. It was just another ordinary day, or so he thought. The cattle were grazing peacefully and everything seemed quiet under the blazing sky. Then he saw it. A thin column of black smoke rising in the distance near the edge of Apache territory. James squinted his eyes trying to make out what was burning. His heart started beating faster. Fire was every rancher's nightmare out here in this dry land. One spark could destroy everything. He kicked his horse into a gallop, racing toward the smoke. As he got closer, the smell hit him first. Burning wood, fabric, and something else he couldn't quite identify. The smoke got thicker, stinging his eyes and making it hard to breathe. He pulled his bandana up over his nose and mouth. That's when he heard it. A voice. A woman's voice crying out for help, desperate and terrified. The sound cut through the crackling and popping of the flames like a knife. James didn't think twice. He didn't care whose wagon it was or who might be inside. Someone needed help, and that was enough. He jumped down from his horse, his boots hitting the hard ground with a thud. The heat from the fire hit him like a wall as he ran closer. The wagon was on its side, the wheels still spinning slowly. The canvas cover was completely engulfed in orange and yellow flames that reached up toward the sky like hungry fingers. Through the thick smoke, James could barely see anything. His eyes watered from the heat and the ash floating in the air. He called out, asking where she was, if she could hear him. The woman's voice answered, weaker this time, coming from underneath the overturned wagon. James dropped to his knees and crawled closer, ignoring the heat that made his skin feel like it was about to blister. That's when he saw her and his breath caught in his throat. She was unlike any woman he'd ever seen before. An Apache woman, young and strong, but trapped beneath a massive wooden beam that had fallen across her legs. What struck him most was her size. She had to be at least 6 feet tall, maybe even a bit more. Her shoulders were broad and muscular, the shoulders of someone who had worked hard their entire life. Her long black hair was spread across the dirt, and her dark eyes locked onto his face with an intensity that was almost frightening. Those eyes held no pleading, no begging. Instead, they burned with defiance and a pride that refused to be broken even in the face of death. But beneath that fierce exterior, James could see something else. Fear. Real, human fear. She was in terrible pain, and she knew the flames were getting closer with every passing second. James grabbed the beam with both hands. The wood was so hot it burned his palms instantly, but he didn't let go. He gritted his teeth and pulled with everything he had. The beam didn't move. It was too heavy, weighed down by parts of the wagon that had collapsed on top of it. The woman said something in Apache, words he couldn't understand. Her voice was strained with pain. She was telling him to leave, he realized, telling him to save himself. But James had never run from someone who needed help, and he wasn't about to start now. He repositioned his grip, planted his feet in the dirt, and pulled again. This time he felt it shift just a little. Encouraged, he pulled harder, ignoring the searing pain in his hands and the smoke filling his lungs. The muscles in his back screamed in protest, but he kept pulling. With a groan of splintering wood, the beam finally lifted. The Apache woman didn't waste a second. Despite her injuries, she pulled herself free with the strength and speed of a mountain lion. Her movements were quick and efficient, even though James could see the pain written across her face. Just as she cleared the beam, there was a loud crack. One of the wagon's wheels exploded from the intense heat, sending burning pieces of wood flying in all directions. James felt something hot graze his arm, but he didn't stop. He grabbed the woman's arm and pulled her up, supporting her weight as they stumbled away from the burning wreckage. They made it about 20 feet before they both collapsed in the dirt, coughing and gasping for air. James's lungs felt like they were on fire, and every breath hurt. Beside him, the Apache woman was breathing hard, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Her buckskin dress was torn and burned in several places, and he could see angry red burns on her arms and legs. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They just lay there in the dirt, watching the wagon burn itself out. The flames were already dying down, having consumed everything they could. All that would be left soon was a blackened skeleton of wood and metal. James finally sat up, wincing at the pain in his hands. He looked down and saw that his palms were covered in blisters, red and raw. He'd have to deal with that later. Right now, he needed to make sure this woman was all right. She was already trying to stand up, pushing herself to her feet with determination. James quickly stood and offered his hand to help, but she ignored it. She made it halfway up before her injured leg gave out, and she would have fallen if James hadn't caught her. This time, she didn't pull away. She leaned on him just for a moment, and James felt the full weight of her. She was solid muscle, strong as any man he'd known, but she was also hurt, and hurt badly. He looked into her eyes again, trying to communicate without words. His ranch was about 2 miles away. She needed medical attention, water, and rest. He gestured toward his horse, then toward the direction of his ranch. The woman studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether she could trust this stranger who had just saved her life. Finally, she gave a slight nod. James helped her over to his horse, and with some difficulty they both got mounted. She sat in front of him, her back straight despite the pain she must have been feeling. As they rode toward his ranch, James couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just changed in ways he couldn't even begin to imagine. The sun was starting to sink lower in the sky, painting the desert in shades of orange and red. Behind them, the last wisps of smoke from the wagon rose into the air and disappeared. James had no idea who this woman was, why she'd been alone, or what had caused the accident. But he knew one thing for certain. He'd just pulled someone very important from those flames, and tomorrow, there would be consequences. There always were. He just had no idea how big those consequences would be. Morning came too quickly for James. He'd spent half the night treating the Apache woman's burns with the few medical supplies he had. His own hands were wrapped in clean bandages, still throbbing with pain. But her injuries were far worse. The burns on her arms and legs needed constant attention to prevent infection. She'd told him her name just before midnight. Nasha. It meant owl in her language, she explained in halting English. Her voice was deep and clear, nothing like the soft-spoken women from town. There was strength in every word she spoke, even when she was clearly suffering. James had given her his own bed and spent the night in a chair by the door, dozing fit in and out. Every time he woke, he found her dark eyes watching him with that same wary expression. She didn't trust him, that much was obvious. And he couldn't really blame her. The relationship between settlers and Apache had been tense for years, marked by violence and broken promises on both sides. As the sun rose and light filtered through the windows of his modest ranch house, James started preparing a simple breakfast. He had eggs from his chickens and some bread he'd baked 2 days ago. Nothing fancy, but it would fill their stomachs. He could hear Nasha moving around in the bedroom, probably trying to stand on her injured leg again. She emerged from the room just as he was setting 2 plates on the table. She'd managed to clean herself up somehow, and despite the bandages and burns, she stood tall and proud. Even injured, she was an imposing figure. James gestured to the chair, inviting her to sit and eat. Nasha lowered herself into the chair carefully, keeping her injured leg straight. She looked at the food, then at James, then back at the food. For a moment, he thought she might refuse to eat. But hunger won out, and she picked up the fork with her bandaged hand. They ate in silence, the only sounds being the clink of forks on plates and the occasional chirp of birds outside. James wanted to ask her what had happened, where she'd been going, but he sensed now wasn't the time. She would tell him when she was ready, or she wouldn't tell him at all. Just after noon, when James was changing the bandages on Nasha's burns, he heard it. The sound of horses, many horses, approaching fast. The thunder of hooves on hard ground made the dishes rattle in his cupboard. Nasha's head snapped up, her body going tense. She said something in Apache, too quick for James to catch. James walked to the window and felt his blood run cold. There had to be at least 15 Apache warriors surrounding his property, maybe more. Their horses stamped and snorted, kicking up clouds of dust. The warriors sat tall in their saddles, faces painted for war, rifles and bows at the ready. This was not a friendly visit. His hand instinctively moved toward the rifle hanging above the fireplace. But before he could take a step, Nasha spoke. Her voice was firm, commanding. She told him not to, that it would only make things worse. James's hand froze, then slowly dropped to his side. He took a deep breath and walked to his front door, stepping out onto the wooden porch. The morning heat hit him immediately, but it was nothing compared to the cold fear creeping up his spine. 15 armed warriors and him alone. If they wanted to kill him, he'd be dead before he could fire a single shot. At the front of the group sat an elderly man who commanded attention without saying a word. His hair was streaked with silver, pulled back from a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. His eyes were sharp and intelligent, missing nothing. He wore traditional Apache clothing adorned with symbols that James didn't recognize but could tell were important. This was a chief, James realized. A man of great authority and respect among his people, and judging by the way he sat his horse and the deference the other warriors showed him, he was not just any chief. This was someone powerful, someone who could end James's life with a simple gesture. The chief dismounted with surprising grace for a man of his age. His movements were smooth and controlled, like a predator who knew exactly how dangerous he was. He walked toward the porch with measured steps, each one deliberate and purposeful. The other warriors remained mounted, hands near their weapons, eyes locked on James. James stood his ground, though every instinct screamed at him to run or reach for his gun. Instead, he kept his hands visible and open, trying to appear non-threatening. The chief stopped a few feet from the porch steps, and for a long moment, the two men simply stared at each other. Then the chief raised his right hand, palm forward, in a gesture of peace. James felt some of the tension leave his shoulders, though he remained alert. The chief spoke, his voice deep and powerful, carrying the weight of authority. He spoke in English, heavily accented but clear enough to understand. He introduced himself as Chief Goyathle, a name that meant something in Apache, but James didn't know what. The chief said he had come for his daughter. His daughter. James felt understanding dawn on him like a sunrise. Nasha wasn't just any Apache woman. She was the daughter of a chief, possibly one of the most important chiefs in the territory. Behind James, the door opened. Nasha stepped out onto the porch, limping slightly but refusing to show weakness in front of her people. She spoke to her father in rapid Apache, words flowing between them too fast for James to follow. But he could read the emotion in their voices. Relief, love, and something else. Concern maybe, or worry. Chief Goyathle's expression softened when he looked at his daughter just for a moment. Then his face became stone again as he turned back to James. He spoke slowly, making sure James understood every word. He was thanking him for saving Nasha's life when she had been attacked by bandits who set fire to her wagon and left her to die. James nodded, accepting the thanks. He started to say it was nothing, that any decent person would have done the same. But the chief held up his hand, silencing him. There was more, something important that needed to be said. The chief's next words hit James like a physical blow. He said that by Apache law and tradition, the man who saves a life becomes responsible for that life. By pulling Nasha from the flames, James had claimed her. She now belonged to him. James felt his mouth go dry. He stammered, trying to find words, but nothing came out. This couldn't be happening. He'd just been trying to help someone who was in danger. He'd never thought about claiming anyone or taking responsibility for their life. He glanced at Nasha, but her face was unreadable, a mask of stoic acceptance. The chief continued speaking, his voice steady and firm. He explained that this debt could be repaid in one of three ways. Nasha could serve James as a worker until the debt was paid. She could be returned to her people with gifts and horses as compensation. Or, and the chief's eyes bore into James's as he said this, James could take Nasha as his wife. The world seemed to tilt under James's feet. Marriage, to a woman he'd known for less than a day. A woman from a completely different culture, who spoke a different language, who lived by different rules. It was impossible. It was insane. But Chief Goyathle wasn't finished. He spoke of the growing tensions between the Apache and the settlers. He talked about raids and counter-raids, about families destroyed on both sides, about a cycle of violence that seemed to have no end. He said he was tired of war, tired of seeing his people die for land that was slowly being taken from them anyway. What he needed, the chief said, was trust. A bridge between the two worlds. Someone he could rely on. Someone who had proven their character through actions rather than empty words. By saving his daughter, James had shown he was different from most white men. He had seen someone in need and helped, regardless of race or history. The chief proposed an alliance. If James would take Nasha as his wife, it would unite their peoples through blood and marriage. It would create a bond that could help prevent future conflicts. The local ranchers would have to respect an alliance with the Apache, and the Apache would have a reason to maintain peace with at least this section of settled land. James looked at Nasha again. She stood straight and tall, her face showing nothing. But her hands, he noticed, were clenched into fists at her sides. This wasn't her choice either. She was being offered up like a bargaining chip, her future decided by men and tradition. Chief Goyatle said he would give James 3 days to make his decision. 3 days to choose whether to accept this incredible responsibility or find another way to repay the debt. Then he mounted his horse in one smooth motion, and the entire group of warriors turned and rode away, leaving nothing but dust and hoofprints behind. James stood on his porch watching them disappear into the distance. Beside him, Nasha remained silent. When the last warrior had vanished from sight, she finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, almost tired. She told him he didn't have to agree, that she would understand if he chose to pay the debt with horses and goods instead, that she knew this wasn't what he wanted. James turned to look at her, really look at her, for the first time since this had all begun. He saw a woman who had been given no choice in her own fate, a woman who was as trapped by tradition as he was, and he realized that whatever decision he made in the next 3 days would change both of their lives forever. The sun continued its path across the sky, marking the hours of his first day. He had 2 more days to decide. 2 days to figure out if he was brave enough or crazy enough to say yes to the most shocking proposal he'd ever received in his life. That night, James couldn't sleep at all. He paced back and forth across the wooden floor of his small ranch house, his boots making soft thuds with each step. The moon cast silver light through the windows, creating long shadows that seemed to move and shift as he walked. His mind was spinning with everything Chief Goyatle had said. Marriage. The word kept echoing in his head like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. He was 32 years old and had never been married, not because he didn't want to, but because the right woman had never come along. Life on a ranch was hard and lonely, and most women from town wanted a man with money, status, and an easy life. James had none of those things. He stopped pacing and looked out the window toward the spare room where Nasha was resting. A thin line of light showed under the door. She was awake too, probably thinking about the same impossible situation. 2 strangers thrown together by chance and tradition, being asked to build a life together. How could that possibly work? James thought about his childhood, growing up on the frontier with parents who loved each other deeply. They'd had a good marriage full of laughter and partnership. Then the Comanche raid came when he was 14, and in one terrible night both his parents were gone. He'd sworn then that he would never add to the cycle of violence, never contribute to the hatred that tore families apart. But this wasn't just about him anymore. Chief Goyatle had made it clear that this was bigger than 2 people. This was about preventing future bloodshed, about building a bridge between 2 worlds that seemed determined to destroy each other. Could one marriage really do all that? It seemed impossible. Then again, a few days ago, pulling a 6-foot-tall Apache warrior woman from a burning wagon had seemed impossible too. The first rays of dawn were creeping over the horizon when James finally sat down at his kitchen table. He put his head in his hands, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him like a physical thing. 3 days seemed like forever and no time at all. When morning fully arrived, Nasha emerged from the spare room. She moved better today, her injuries healing faster than James had expected. Apache people were tough, he'd heard, and now he was seeing it firsthand. She'd wrapped fresh bandages around her burns using supplies she'd found, not wanting to bother him. She didn't say good morning or ask how he'd slept. Instead, she simply walked past him and out the front door. James watched through the window as she made her way to the horse corral. Despite her limp, she moved with purpose and confidence. She approached his horses, speaking to them in soft Apache words, and to his surprise, the animals responded immediately. His most temperamental mare, a brown beauty named Rosie who usually bit anyone who came near her, walked right up to Nasha and nuzzled her hand. Nasha stroked the horse's nose, continuing to speak in that low, soothing voice. Then she began checking the horses over one by one, looking at their hooves, running her hands down their legs, checking for any signs of injury or illness. James grabbed his coffee and went outside. He leaned against the porch railing and watched her work. She handled the horses with an expert touch, the kind of skill that only came from a lifetime of experience. When she found a small cut on one gelding's leg, she cleaned and treated it without being asked, using materials from his barn. After about an hour, Nasha seemed to sense him watching. She turned and met his eyes across the yard. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she walked over to where he stood, moving with that same proud bearing despite her injuries. She asked him a direct question. Did he want her to leave? Should she tell her father that the debt would be paid with horses and goods? Her voice was steady, but James thought he detected something underneath. Not hope or fear exactly, but maybe curiosity. She wanted to know what kind of man he was. James realized this was important. How he answered this question would set the tone for everything that came after. He chose his words carefully. He told her that he didn't believe in owning people, that he thought the whole idea of a life debt was strange to him, though he respected that it was part of her culture. He said he'd saved her because she needed help, not because he wanted anything in return. Nasha tilted her head slightly, studying him like he was a puzzle she was trying to figure out. She asked him what he would decide. James admitted he didn't know yet, that he needed to understand what this would really mean for both of them. Then he asked her a question that had been bothering him since yesterday. What did she want? In all of this talk of tradition and alliances and debts, nobody had asked her what she wanted. Her father had offered her up without consulting her. But James wanted to know. If the choice was really hers, what would she choose? Nasha seemed surprised by the question. She was quiet for a long time, staring out at the desert landscape. When she finally spoke, her words came slowly, like she was discovering them as she said them. She told him that Apache women didn't usually get asked what they wanted. They were expected to follow tradition, to do what was best for the tribe. But if she was being honest, she was tired of war too. Tired of watching her people die. Tired of the endless cycle of revenge and violence. She said she'd lost her mother to a settler's bullet 3 years ago. Her younger brother had been killed in a raid just last winter. Her father was getting old, and the weight of keeping their people alive was crushing him. If her marriage to a white rancher could help bring peace, even just to this small area, maybe that would be worth it. But then she looked directly at James, and her eyes were fierce. She told him she wouldn't be a servant or a slave. If they did this, it would have to be as equals, partners. She knew how to work hard, how to survive in harsh conditions, how to hunt and track and fight if necessary. She could be useful to him, but she wouldn't be owned. James felt something shift inside him as she spoke. This wasn't some helpless woman who needed to be rescued or taken care of. This was a warrior, a survivor, someone who had seen the worst life could throw at her and was still standing. Someone who understood loss and pain but was willing to try for peace anyway. He told her he'd need the rest of the day to think, but that he appreciated her honesty. Nasha nodded and turned to go back to the horses. But James called after her. He asked if she would teach him some Apache words. If they were going to live together, whether as married partners or just until the debt was paid, he should probably be able to communicate better. For the first time since he'd met her, Nasha smiled. It was a small smile, barely there, but it transformed her face. She looked younger, less burdened. She agreed and spent the next hour teaching him basic words and phrases in her language. James was a terrible student, stumbling over pronunciations and mixing up similar-sounding words, but Nasha was patient. When he finally got a phrase right, she nodded in approval. The second day passed in a strange kind of partnership. Nasha helped around the ranch, insisting on being useful despite her injuries. James watched her interact with his animals, his land, and his simple way of life. He saw how she appreciated the quiet beauty of sunrise over the mountains, how she wasted nothing and treated everything with respect. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, James made up his mind. He would accept Chief Goyathle's proposal, but with conditions. He would marry Nasha, but it would be a partnership of equals. She would be free to leave whenever she wanted. They would learn each other's ways and respect each other's cultures. And any children they might have would be taught both worlds, free to choose their own path. He explained all this to Nasha. She listened without interrupting, her face thoughtful. When he finished, she asked him why he would agree to this. James thought about it for a moment, then gave her the honest answer. He told her that he'd spent his whole life watching people hurt each other over fear and misunderstanding. He'd lost his own parents to that violence. If there was even a small chance that this could help stop that cycle, even just in this one small corner of the world, he had to try. Besides, he added with a slight smile, he could use someone who was good with horses. Nasha studied him for a long moment. Then she extended her hand in the white man's gesture of agreement. James shook it, feeling the strength in her grip despite the bandages. They had a deal. Now they just had to see if they could actually make it work. The next morning, when Chief Goyathle returned with his warriors, James was ready. He stood on his porch with Nasha beside him, and he presented his terms to the chief. He would marry Nasha, but as equals and partners, she would be free to leave if she chose. They would respect both cultures and raise any children to know both worlds. James expected the chief to be angry or insulted by these conditions. Instead, Chief Goyathle did something unexpected. The stern, stone-faced chief smiled. It was a real smile, reaching his eyes and transforming his entire face. He told James that he understood more than most white men, that these terms were acceptable. In fact, they were more than he'd hoped for. The chief explained that he'd been watching James for a while, even before the wagon fire. He'd heard stories about the rancher who treated everyone fairly, who didn't cheat or steal, who kept his word. That's why he'd made this proposal. He needed someone he could trust, and James had proven himself worthy of that trust. The news of the upcoming wedding spread across the territory like wildfire. James had sent word to his neighboring ranchers, expecting maybe a handful to show up. After all, he was about to marry an Apache woman, something that was practically unheard of in these parts. Many settlers viewed the Apache as enemies, raiders who had attacked farms and stolen livestock. The idea of one of their own willingly marrying into that world was shocking, even scandalous. The 3 days before the wedding were a whirlwind of activity. Chief Goyathle's people set up a camp about a mile from James's ranch. The Apache women arrived with Nasha's belongings, her traditional clothes, and items for the ceremony. James watched as they transformed part of his simple property into something beautiful and sacred. On the settler side, the response was mixed. Some of James's neighbors refused to come, sending messages that ranged from disappointed to outright hostile. Old Tom Bradley, who owned the ranch to the north, sent a note saying James was making the biggest mistake of his life. But others were curious or supportive or just wanted to witness this historic event for themselves. Robert Chen, the Chinese merchant who ran the general store in town, sent a beautiful silk ribbon as a gift. He wrote that he understood what it was like to be caught between two worlds and wished them both happiness. Mrs. Patterson, the widow who owned a small farm nearby, brought over a freshly baked pie and told James that anyone who would run into a burning wagon to save a stranger was a good man in her book. James spent those 3 days getting to know Nasha better. She was slowly opening up to him, sharing bits and pieces of her life. She told him about growing up as the chief's daughter, about learning to ride before she could walk, about the responsibility that came with her position in the tribe. Her life had been anything but easy. She described the changes she'd witnessed over the years, how the buffalo herds had shrunk, how the Apache lands had gotten smaller as more settlers arrived, how the old ways were disappearing. Her people were being squeezed into smaller and smaller territories, and the young warriors were angry. They wanted to fight back, to reclaim what had been taken. But her father believed that fighting would only lead to more death. James shared his own story too. He told her about losing his parents, about building this ranch from nothing with just his own 2 hands. He talked about the loneliness of frontier life, the hard winters, the constant struggle to make the land productive. He admitted that he'd never thought he'd get married, that he'd accepted being alone. But as they talked, something unexpected started to happen. They began to find common ground. Both understood loss and hardship. Both valued hard work and honesty. Both were willing to try something new if it meant building a better future. The awkwardness between them didn't disappear completely, but it started to ease. Nasha proved herself useful around the ranch in ways James hadn't expected. She repaired a broken fence using techniques he'd never seen before, stronger and more efficient than his methods. She showed him tracking signs he'd been missing, pointing out where coyotes had been prowling near his chicken coop. She even taught him how to make a traditional Apache remedy for his blistered hands that worked better than anything he'd tried. The day before the wedding, Nasha's aunt arrived. She was a stern woman named Desba, which meant goes to war, and she looked like she could live up to that name. She barely acknowledged James, instead sweeping Nasha away to prepare for the ceremony. James was left alone with his thoughts and a growing sense of nervousness about what tomorrow would bring. That evening, following tradition, he and Nasha couldn't see each other. James sat on his porch as the sun went down, drinking coffee and trying to calm his racing mind. Tomorrow he would stand in front of dozens of people and marry a woman he'd known for less than a week. A woman from a completely different culture, who spoke a different language and lived by different rules. Was he doing the right thing? The question kept nagging at him. What if this didn't work? What if they couldn't bridge the gap between their worlds? What if he was setting them both up for failure? But then he remembered the way Nasha had looked at him when he'd told her they would be equals. The surprise and respect in her eyes. He thought about her strength and intelligence, the way she refused to give up even when trapped under that burning wagon. He remembered his promise to himself to never contribute to the cycle of violence. This was his chance to actually build something instead of just avoiding destruction. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and beautiful. The sky was a brilliant blue without a cloud in sight, and a gentle breeze kept the worst of the heat at bay. James put on his best clothes, a clean white shirt and dark pants that he usually only wore to church on special occasions. His hands shook a little as he buttoned the shirt. By afternoon, people started arriving. James was surprised to see how many actually came. At least 30 settlers showed up, some out of genuine support, others probably just curious to see this unprecedented union. They clustered on one side of the area that had been prepared for the ceremony, talking among themselves in low voices. On the other side, Apache families arrived on horseback. The warriors James had seen that first day were there, but now they were joined by women, children, and elders. They brought drums and traditional instruments James didn't recognize. And two groups eyed each other warily, but Chief Goyatle had made it clear that this was a day of peace and anyone who caused trouble would answer to him. As sunset approached, James took his place in the center of the gathering. His heart was pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. A minister from town agreed to perform the Christian part of the ceremony, though he looked nervous about the whole situation. An Apache holy man stood ready to perform their traditional rites. Then Nasha appeared, and James forgot how to breathe. She wore a stunning combination of both cultures. Her dress was traditional Apache buckskin, decorated with intricate beadwork that must have taken months to create. The designs told a story, though James couldn't read them. But over it she wore a simple white veil that Mrs. Patterson had lent her, a gesture that had nearly brought Nasha to tears when the old widow offered it. She was beautiful, not in the delicate, fragile way that town ladies aimed for, but in a powerful, natural way that took his breath away. She walked toward him with her head held high, her limp barely noticeable now. Her father walked beside her, his face proud and solemn. When Nasha reached James, Chief Goyatle placed her hand in James's. The chief's grip was strong as he clasped both their hands together. He spoke in Apache first, words that flowed like poetry, then repeated the meaning in English for the settlers to understand. He was giving his daughter to this man, but also giving this man to his daughter. They were being joined not just to each other, but to two peoples who desperately needed to find a way to coexist. The ceremony itself was unlike anything anyone there had ever witnessed. The minister spoke the traditional Christian vows, asking if they would honor and cherish each other. Both James and Nasha answered clearly, their voices strong and sure. Then the Apache holy man performed rituals that involved sage smoke, blessed water, and prayers to the four directions. James and Nasha exchanged simple rings, bands of silver that James had bought from Mr. Chen's store. When Nasha spoke her vows, she did so in both Apache and English, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd. She promised to stand beside James as his partner, to share in his struggles and his victories, to help build a bridge between their peoples. When James spoke his vows, he looked directly into Nasha's eyes. He promised to respect her and her culture, to never try to change who she was, to learn from her and teach her in return. He promised to work for peace between their peoples and to raise any children they might have to be proud of both their heritages. As the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. The minister pronounced them husband and wife. The Apache drums began to beat, a deep rhythm that seemed to match the beating of James's heart. Some of the settlers clapped, tentatively at first, then more enthusiastically. The two groups began to mix, hesitantly, but mix nonetheless. A feast followed, with food from both cultures. The Apache had brought venison and wild game, cooked with herbs and methods passed down through generations. The settlers contributed pies, bread, and dishes from their own traditions. People who had been enemies just hours before were now sharing meals and, in some cases, even conversation. James stood with Nasha, greeting guests from both sides. He noticed how some settlers still looked uncomfortable, and how some Apache warriors kept their distance. This wasn't a miracle cure for years of conflict and mistrust, but it was a start. A small crack in the wall of hatred that divided them. As the evening wore on and the stars came out, Nasha leaned close to James and spoke quietly. She told him she was glad it was him who had pulled her from the flames, that she believed they could make this work if they both tried. James squeezed her hand gently and agreed. They would both have to try every single day. But looking at the mixed crowd of Apache and settlers sharing food and conversation, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The first morning after the wedding felt strange and awkward. James woke up early, as he always did, and for a moment forgot that his life had completely changed. Then he heard movement in the kitchen and remembered. He was married now. Nasha was his wife. The weight of that reality settled over him like a heavy blanket. He found her already up, making coffee using his pot but adding something from a small pouch she carried. When she poured him a cup, the smell was different, richer, with hints of something he couldn't identify. He took a sip and was surprised. It was better than any coffee he'd ever made. Nasha explained that it was a mix of coffee and roasted herbs her people used. She asked if he minded her changing things. James realized this would be the first of many adjustments they'd both have to make. He told her the coffee was good and that his kitchen was hers now too. She could change whatever she wanted. The first few weeks were a careful dance of learning each other's rhythms. James was used to living alone, doing things his own way, on his own schedule. Now he had to think about another person, consider her needs and preferences. Nasha was dealing with the same adjustment, plus the added challenge of adapting to settler ways while maintaining her own identity. She taught him Apache customs and language every evening after the work was done. James proved to be a slow but determined student. The language was complex, with sounds his tongue struggled to form. But Nasha was patient, correcting his pronunciation over and over until he got it right. In return, James taught her to read and write English better, showing her the letters and how they formed words. The real bonding happened during the work. Nasha threw herself into ranch life with an energy that amazed James. She learned how to milk the cows, though she found the whole process amusing. Apache people didn't keep cattle the way settlers did, and she joked that the cows were much less dignified than buffalo. But she mastered the skill anyway, her strong hands making quick work of the morning milking. James learned from her too. She showed him Apache hunting techniques that were far more efficient than his methods. She could track an animal across ground that looked blank to his eyes, reading signs in bent grass and disturbed dirt that told entire stories. When she brought down a deer with her bow from incredible distance, James just stared in amazement. She was a better hunter than any man he'd ever known, but it wasn't all smooth. There were moments of frustration and misunderstanding. Once Nasha rearranged his entire barn, putting tools and equipment in different places. James spent an hour looking for his hammer before finally asking her. She'd organized everything by function and frequency of use, which made logical sense, but wasn't how he was used to doing things. They had their first real argument about it. James said she should have asked first before changing his system. Nasha fired back that it wasn't just his barn anymore, it was theirs, and her system was better. They stood there glaring at each other for a long moment before James realized how ridiculous they must look. He started laughing, and after a moment Nasha joined in. They compromised, combining both systems. The neighboring ranchers watched the arrangement with varying degrees of skepticism and curiosity. Some, like old Tom Bradley, refused to acknowledge Nasha at all when he occasionally had to deal with James. Others, like Mrs. Patterson, went out of their way to be welcoming, inviting them both to a community barn raising and making sure everyone knew Nasha was to be treated with respect. The real test came when one of James's cows got sick with a mysterious illness that was spreading through the area. Several ranchers had already lost animals and no one knew how to stop it. James was worried sick, watching his prize-breeding cow get weaker each day. Nasha studied the sick animal carefully, then asked to see the grazing areas. She spent 2 hours walking the pastures, examining plants and water sources. Finally, she found it. A particular weed growing near the stream, something toxic that the cows were eating. The Apache knew this plant well and knew how to treat animals who'd consumed it. Nasha prepared a remedy using herbs she gathered from the hills, and within 3 days the cow was recovering. Word spread quickly. When other ranchers heard that Nasha had cured the illness, they started showing up at James's ranch, hat in hand, asking for help. Nasha treated their animals too, never asking for payment but accepting the thanks and respect that came with it. Slowly, grudgingly, the community started to see her as something other than that Apache woman. She was becoming Nasha McCarthy, the rancher's wife who could heal sick animals. The Apache side had its own adjustments. When Nasha brought James to visit her father's camp for the first time since the wedding, many warriors were suspicious. They saw him as an outsider, a white man who had no business being there. Nasha's cousin, a young warrior named Nako, was particularly hostile. He made comments in Apache that he thought James wouldn't understand, but James had been learning. When Nako made a particularly insulting remark, James responded in halting but clear Apache, telling the young warrior that he was trying to build bridges, not walls. The entire camp went silent. Then Chief Goyathle laughed, a deep booming sound that broke the tension. He praised James for learning their language and told the warriors that this man was family now. That visit turned into an unexpected lesson for James. Nasha showed him how her people lived, their daily routines, their values, their connection to the land. He saw children playing games that looked both foreign and somehow familiar. He watched warriors training, their skill with weapons both impressive and slightly frightening. He shared meals prepared in traditional ways, eating foods he'd never tasted before. What struck him most was the sense of community. Everyone had a role, everyone contributed, and everyone looked out for each other. It was different from settler society where people were more isolated, more independent. James found himself appreciating both ways of life and wondering if there wasn't some way to combine the best of both. Back at the ranch, James and Nasha fell into a comfortable partnership. She handled the animals with a skill that freed him up to focus on repairs and building projects. Together, they were more efficient than James had ever been alone. The ranch started to prosper in small but noticeable ways. One evening, about 2 months after the wedding, they sat on the porch watching the sunset, as had become their habit. Nasha was mending a shirt while James carved a new handle for a tool that had broken. The silence between them was comfortable now, not awkward. Nasha set down her sewing and looked at James. She told him that when her father first proposed this marriage, she had been angry. Angry at being used as a bargaining chip, angry at having her future decided without her input, angry at the situation that made such arrangements necessary. But now she said she was glad. James had kept every promise he'd made. He treated her as an equal partner, he respected her culture, and he was genuinely trying to learn and understand her people. James set down his carving. He admitted that he'd been terrified at first. Terrified of making a mistake, of not being good enough, of this whole experiment failing. But Nasha had made it easy. She'd thrown herself into this partnership with courage and determination. She'd taught him so much, not just about Apache ways, but about being a better person. Then Nasha said something that made James's heart skip a beat. She told him that she was starting to have real feelings for him. Not just respect or partnership, but something deeper. She said she understood if he didn't feel the same way, that their marriage had started as a political arrangement and feelings couldn't be forced, but she wanted him to know. James felt emotion well up in his chest. He told her that he felt it too. He couldn't pinpoint exactly when it had happened. Maybe it was watching her gentle patience with the animals, or her fierce pride when dealing with people who disrespected her, or her quiet strength when things got difficult. But somewhere along the way, this arrangement had become real for him too. They sat there in the fading light, hands clasped together, both of them a little amazed at how something that had started so strangely had become something genuine. Their marriage had begun as a political alliance, a way to build peace between two worlds. But it was becoming something more. It was becoming real love, growing slowly but steadily, built on mutual respect, shared work, and the courage to bridge impossible gaps. That night, for the first time since the wedding, the distance between them fully disappeared. They were no longer just partners in an arrangement. They were husband and wife in truth, choosing each other not because tradition demanded it, but because they genuinely wanted to. And that made all the difference. As spring turned to summer in 1888, the McCarthy Ranch became known throughout the territory as a place where two worlds met. James and Nasha had built something unique, a working partnership that proved Apache and settler could not just coexist, but thrive together. But not everyone was happy about it. The town of Red Creek, about 10 miles from the ranch, had always been split in its opinions about the marriage. Some folks had come around, especially after Nasha saved their livestock from that mysterious illness, but others remained deeply suspicious. Change came slowly to frontier towns, and some people preferred their prejudices to the uncomfortable work of rethinking old assumptions. One day in late June, James needed to go into town for supplies. Nasha wanted to come along, something she'd been avoiding since the wedding. She knew her presence made some people uncomfortable, and she'd been content to stay on the ranch where she was valued. But James encouraged her to come. This was her home now too, and she had every right to be part of the community. The ride into town was pleasant, the morning still cool before the heat of the day set in. They talked about plans for expanding the cattle herd and possibly getting some sheep. Nasha thought sheep would do well on the rocky terrain that wasn't good for cattle. James was learning to trust her judgment on such matters. She understood the land in ways he was only beginning to grasp. When they arrived in Red Creek, the reaction was immediate. People stopped their conversations to stare. Some nodded politely, others whispered behind their hands, and a few deliberately turned away. Nasha's face showed nothing, but James could feel the tension in her posture. He wanted to say something to defend her, but she'd asked him not to. She said she needed to earn respect on her own terms, not hide behind his protection. They went to Chen's general store first. Robert Chen greeted them warmly, as he always did. He'd become a good friend to both of them, perhaps because he understood what it was like to be seen as different in this frontier town. He showed them new merchandise, including some beautiful fabric that he thought Nasha might like for a new dress. While they were browsing, old Harold Peterson came into the store. He was a rancher who'd lost significant livestock to Apache raids years ago, and he'd never forgiven or forgotten. He saw Nasha and his face turned red with anger. He started making loud comments about how some people had no shame, bringing savages into civilized society. James felt his temper rising, but before he could say anything, Nasha calmly walked over to Peterson. She looked him directly in the eye and spoke in perfect English, her voice clear and firm. She told him she was sorry for his losses, that war hurt everyone and that she was trying to build a different future. She said she understood his anger but hoped that someday he might see her as a person, rather than just an enemy. Peterson seemed taken aback by her directness. He sputtered for a moment, then stormed out of the store without buying anything. Chen shook his head and apologized, but Nasha just shrugged. She said she'd expected worse and was actually a bit disappointed Peterson hadn't been more creative with his insults. The real turning point came a few weeks later. The annual summer gathering was a big event in Red Creek, bringing together ranchers and farmers from the whole region for 3 days of competition, trading, and socializing. There were horse races, shooting contests, roping competitions, and all sorts of games and challenges. James had participated every year since settling in the area. This year, he wanted Nasha to come. She was reluctant, knowing she'd face judgment and hostility, but James argued that hiding away would only make people think she was afraid or had something to be ashamed of. Better to face them head-on, show them who she really was. Finally, Nasha agreed, but with one condition. She wouldn't just attend. She'd compete. The day of the gathering arrived hot and clear. Dozens of families had come from all over the territory, setting up camps and tents around the main field. When James and Nasha arrived, the whisper started immediately. Many people had heard about the Apache woman who'd married James McCarthy, but this was their first time seeing her in person. Nasha's height and build drew attention even beyond her heritage. She stood as tall as most men and had the bearing of a warrior. She wore practical clothes, a mix of settler and Apache style, with her long dark hair braided down her back. She looked like someone who could handle herself, and that made some people nervous. The first event was the shooting contest. Traditionally, only men participated, but there was no official rule against women. When Nasha signed up, there was actual laughter from some of the contestants. One man, Buck Wilson, made a crude joke about playing Indian that his friends found hilarious. Nasha ignored them. She stepped up to the line with her rifle, a weapon James had given her and she'd spent weeks learning to use properly. The targets were set at increasing distances, and each shooter had to hit all 5 to advance. Most of the men did well enough, hitting 3 or 4 targets. Buck Wilson hit all 5 and strutted around like he'd already won. Then it was Nasha's turn. She loaded her rifle calmly, took her stance, and fired. The first target went down. Then the second, third, fourth, fifth, all perfect hits and faster than Buck had done it. The crowd went silent. In the second round, with targets even farther out, several men missed. Buck hit 4 out of 5. Nasha hit all 5 again. By the final round, it was down to just Nasha and Buck. The targets were now at extreme range, difficult shots even for experienced marksmen. Buck went first, taking his time, and managed to hit 3 out of 5. Respectable shooting. Then Nasha stepped up. She seemed to enter a different state, completely focused, her breathing steady. One by one, all 5 targets fell. Nasha had won. The crowd erupted, some in cheers, others in shocked silence. Buck Wilson looked like he'd been slapped. The judge, after consulting with the other organizers, had no choice but to award Nasha the first-place prize, a new rifle and $20. As he handed it to her, he muttered that he hoped she was happy. Nasha smiled and said she was very happy indeed, but she wasn't done. Next came the horse race, a challenging course that wound through rough terrain. Again, Nasha entered. And again, despite skepticism and some outright hostility, she proved herself. She'd grown up on horseback, riding before she could walk, and it showed. She navigated the course with skill and speed that left the other competitors in her dust. By the end of the day, Nasha had placed first or second in every event she'd entered. The prizes were piling up, but more importantly, the attitude toward her was shifting. People who'd dismissed her as just an Apache woman were now watching with grudging respect. Some even approached to congratulate her, awkward but genuine. The event that really changed minds came on the second day. Mrs. Henderson's young son, Tommy, who was about 8 years old, somehow got separated from his family. He'd wandered off into the brush chasing a rabbit and gotten lost. When his mother realized he was missing and raised the alarm, panic set in. The area around Red Creek had coyotes, snakes, and rough terrain. A small child alone out there was in serious danger. Search parties organized immediately, men fanning out in different directions. But as an hour passed with no sign of the boy, fear grew. The sun would be setting in a few hours, and finding him in the dark would be nearly impossible. Nasha approached the distraught mother and asked for something that belonged to Tommy, something with his scent. Mrs. Henderson, desperate, gave her the boy's hat that he'd left behind. Nasha studied it, then studied the ground where Tommy had last been seen. She moved slowly, carefully, reading signs that no one else could see. James followed as Nasha tracked the boy. She showed him bent grass, a small footprint in soft dirt, a broken twig at child height. She moved with absolute confidence, following a trail that was invisible to everyone else. The search party members who'd been skeptical started following her lead, trusting her expertise. After nearly 2 hours of tracking, Nasha led them to a rocky outcrop about 3 miles from town. There, wedged in a small cave, frightened and crying but unhurt, was Tommy Henderson. He'd gotten scared and hidden when he couldn't find his way back. Nasha approached him carefully, speaking in a gentle voice, and coaxed him out. The reunion between mother and son was tearful and joyous. Mrs. Henderson, who'd been one of the people most uncomfortable with Nasha's presence in the community, broke down crying and hugged Nasha like a sister. She said she'd never forget what Nasha had done, never. Other women gathered around, offering their own thanks and acceptance. That night, at the gathering's community dinner, something remarkable happened. People who'd been cold or hostile to Nasha now sought her out. They asked about her tracking skills, about Apache ways, about her life. They listened with genuine interest instead of suspicion. James watched as his wife, who'd faced so much prejudice, was finally being seen for who she really was. A skilled, intelligent, capable woman who had much to offer the community. The old-timers who'd been most resistant started to crack too. After a few drinks, even Buck Wilson came over to where Nasha sat. He mumbled an apology for his earlier rudeness and admitted she was the best shot he'd ever seen. Nasha accepted his apology gracefully and even gave him some tips on his stance that might improve his shooting. The peace James and Nasha had worked so hard to build was fragile, like a thin sheet of ice over deep water. It held through the summer and into early fall of 1888, but both of them knew it wouldn't take much to shatter it. The test came on a cool October evening when they least expected it. The trouble had been brewing for weeks among some of the younger Apache warriors. A group of them, frustrated with watching their people's lands continue to shrink and their way of life disappear, had started talking about taking action. They were tired of waiting, tired of watching the old chiefs make peace while more settlers arrived every day. Chief Goyathle had tried to counsel patience, explaining that open war would only bring soldiers and more death. But young men filled with anger and righteousness rarely listened to words of caution. They wanted to fight back, to remind the settlers that this land still belonged to the Apache. James and Nasha heard rumors about the unrest through visitors to their ranch. Both Apache and settler friends warned them that something was coming. The young warriors were planning raids, targeting ranches that had been built on what the Apache considered sacred ground. The settlers, in turn, were organizing their own groups, talking about striking first before the Apache could attack. It was exactly the kind of spiral toward violence that their marriage was supposed to help prevent. But James and Nasha were just two people. They couldn't be everywhere, couldn't stop every hot-headed young man on either side from doing something stupid. The night it happened, James and Nasha were just finishing a late dinner. They'd spent the day repairing the roof on the barn, hard work that left them both tired and ready for rest. Nasha was teaching James a new Apache word when they heard the sound of horses approaching fast. James grabbed his rifle instinctively, but Nasha put her hand on his arm. She listened carefully to the sound of the hoofbeats. Apache horses, she said. She could tell by the rhythm. James trusted her judgment and lowered the rifle slightly but kept it ready. The riders came fast and hard, at least 6 or 7 of them. In the darkness, James couldn't make out faces, but he could see they were Apache warriors, young ones carrying weapons. His heart sank. This was what they'd been afraid of. The raiders had come, and in the darkness they probably didn't know whose ranch this was. Gunfire erupted almost immediately. The raiders were shooting at the house, probably thinking to scare the occupants and then steal horses and cattle. James and Nasha both dropped to the floor as bullets shattered windows and thudded into the wooden walls. James started to return fire, but Nasha stopped him again. She said something in rapid Apache that James didn't catch, then crawled to the broken window. Before James could stop her, she stood up, completely exposed, and shouted something in Apache. Her voice cut through the gunfire like a knife, loud and commanding, unmistakably the voice of a chief's daughter. The shooting stopped abruptly. There was confused shouting among the raiders, and in the silence that followed, James could hear his own heart pounding. Nasha continued speaking in Apache, her voice firm but not angry. James caught some of the words. She was asking who led them, why they were attacking this ranch if they knew whose home this was. One of the riders moved closer, his horse stepping into the moonlight. James recognized him then. Nako, Nasha's young cousin, the warrior who'd been hostile to James at that first visit to the Apache camp. The young man's face showed shock, then shame, then defiant anger, all in quick succession. Nasha stepped out onto the porch and James's heart nearly stopped. She was standing completely in the open, lit by the moon, making herself a perfect target, but she showed no fear. She spoke directly to Nako, and though James couldn't understand all the words, he understood the tone. She was disappointed, hurt that her own cousin would attack her home. Nako shouted back, his voice full of angry justification. James caught enough to understand. He was saying that Nasha had betrayed her people by marrying a white man, that she'd chosen comfort over honor, that she'd forgotten who she really was. Nasha's response was swift and cutting. She said she hadn't forgotten anything. She knew exactly who she was, a daughter of the Apache who was trying to save her people by building bridges instead of burning them. She asked Nako how many more Apache needed to die before he was satisfied. How many mothers needed to weep over lost sons? How many children needed to grow up without fathers? She talked about the bigger picture, about the reality they all faced. More settlers were coming, she said. That was fact, not opinion. The Apache could fight and die, or they could find ways to adapt and survive. Her marriage was about creating a path for survival, about proving that both peoples could share this land. The other young warriors shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. These weren't hardened killers. They were frustrated young men who'd been raised on stories of Apache glory, who wanted to prove themselves, who were angry about watching their world change. Nasha's words were getting through to them, but Nako was their leader and he couldn't back down without losing face. He raised his rifle, pointing it directly at Nasha. James started to move, but Nasha shook her head slightly. She trusted her cousin not to shoot. She had to. If she showed fear now, if she ran for cover, everything she'd said would lose its power. She spoke softly now, so softly that James had to strain to hear. She reminded Nako of when they were children, how they'd played together, how she'd taught him to track deer, how they'd sworn to always protect the tribe. She said she was still protecting the tribe, just in a different way than he understood. She asked him to trust her, to give peace a chance. For a long moment, Nako kept the rifle pointed at her. His hands were shaking, and James could see the inner struggle playing out on his face. Pride warred with family loyalty. Anger fought against love for his cousin. Finally, slowly, he lowered the weapon, but he wasn't done. He told Nasha that the raids would continue. Other ranches, other targets. The young warriors had made their decision. They would fight back against the settlers who kept taking Apache land. But out of respect for her, out of memory of their childhood together, he would spare this ranch. He would tell the other warriors that the McCarthy property was off limits. Then he said something that made Nasha flinch. He told her that this was goodbye. He couldn't follow her path and she wouldn't follow his. They were family by blood, but they'd chosen different sides. He hoped someday she'd understand why he had to do this. Then he turned his horse and led the other warriors away into the darkness. Nasha stood there for a long time after they'd gone, staring into the night. James finally came out and stood beside her. He didn't say anything, just put his hand on her shoulder. She leaned against him and he felt her shake. Not from fear, he realized, but from grief. She'd just lost her cousin, maybe forever. She'd been forced to choose between her old life and her new one, and even though she believed in the choice she'd made, it still hurt. James held her while she cried, quiet tears that she'd been holding back during the confrontation. But there was no time to grieve. If Nako's group was raiding, other ranches were in danger. James needed to warn the neighbors, and they needed to figure out how to stop this before it spiraled into all-out war. They spent the rest of the night riding to nearby ranches, alerting people to the danger. The response was mixed. Some ranchers thanked them for the warning and started preparing defenses. Others blamed James and Nasha, saying that the marriage had stirred up trouble, that things had been fine before they tried to bridge the gap between Apache and settler. James tried to explain that the trouble had been coming anyway, but angry people rarely want to listen to reason. Over the next 2 weeks, Nako's group hit 3 more ranches. They stole horses and cattle, but, true to Nako's word, they avoided the McCarthy property. That fact alone made some settlers suspicious of James and Nasha, whispering that maybe they were in league with the raiders. Chief Goyathle called a council meeting and invited James and Nasha to attend. The old chief looked tired, the burden of his position showing in the lines on his face. He told the gathered tribe members that the raids had to stop. The soldiers were already being called in, and when they came, they wouldn't distinguish between raiding warriors and peaceful families. Everyone would suffer, but the young warriors, including Nako, refused to attend the council. They'd set up their own camp away from the main tribe and were planning more raids. They saw themselves as the true defenders of Apache honor, and the older generation as weak and defeated. Nasha spoke at the council, her voice carrying across the assembled people. She talked about her time living among the settlers, about the good people she'd met who wanted peace as much as the Apache did. She talked about the skills she'd learned and taught, about the respect she'd earned, about the possibility of 2 peoples living side by side. Some listened. Some nodded in agreement, but others looked away, unable to meet her eyes. She was asking them to give up their old ways, to accept a future that looked nothing like their past. That was a hard thing for any people to accept. James also spoke through Nasha's translation. He talked about the settlers who supported peace, who respected the Apache and wanted to find ways to share the land. The winter of 1888 was harsh, but not just because of the cold. The tension between settlers and Apache reached a breaking point when federal soldiers arrived in the territory. They'd been called in to stop the raids, and they brought with them the kind of heavy-handed tactics that made things worse instead of better. Innocent Apache families were questioned, searched, and sometimes relocated, while the actual raiders remained hidden in the hills. James and Nasha found themselves caught in an impossible position. The settlers expected James to side with them, to support the military presence and the crackdown on Apache. The Apache expected Nasha to protect her people, to use her influence with the settlers to ease the pressure. Both of them were trying to do right by everyone, and it was tearing them apart. But something unexpected happened during those difficult months. The McCarthy Ranch became a neutral ground, a place where both sides could meet and talk without fear. James and Nasha opened their home to anyone who wanted to find peaceful solutions. Settlers who were afraid of raids but didn't want war came to discuss protection strategies that didn't involve attacking innocent people. Apache families who needed supplies or help navigating settler bureaucracy came knowing they'd be treated fairly. Chief Goyathle became a regular visitor, often bringing other tribal elders. They would sit with James and Nasha for hours, planning ways to reach the young warriors and convince them to stop the raids. The old chief had aged visibly over the past months, the stress of trying to protect his people while preventing war taking its toll. One cold February morning, Nasha woke up feeling different. She'd been tired for weeks, more tired than hard work usually made her. At first, she thought it was just the stress, the emotional weight of everything happening around them. But when the nausea started, she knew she was pregnant. She told James that evening after dinner, watching his face carefully for his reaction. For a moment, he just stared at her, processing the information. Then a smile spread across his face, so wide and genuine that it made her smile too. He was going to be a father. They were going to have a child. But the joy was tempered with worry. What kind of world were they bringing a child into? A world torn by violence and mistrust? Where their child would be seen as half-breed by some on both sides, never fully accepted anywhere? Nasha voiced these fears, and James listened without interrupting. When she finished, he took her hands in his. He said that yes, their child would face challenges, but their child would also have something special. The best of both worlds, both cultures, both peoples. Their child would be living proof that Apache and settler could come together, could create something beautiful instead of destroying each other. Their child would be hope made flesh. Word of Nasha's pregnancy spread quickly through both communities. The reactions were as mixed as everything else in their lives. Some settlers made cruel jokes about half-breeds. Some Apache worried that the child would be rejected by both peoples. But many on both sides saw it as Chief Goyathle did when he heard the news. The old chief came to the ranch personally, his weathered face showing genuine joy for the first time in months. He told them that this child would be his grandchild, a bridge between two worlds. He said that the baby would carry both Apache and settler blood, both histories, both futures. In traditional Apache belief, children were sacred, gifts from the Creator. This child would be especially sacred, a symbol of what could be instead of what had been. The chief made an announcement to the tribe. This child would be welcomed and protected by the Apache people. Anyone who dishonored the child would answer to him personally. It was a powerful statement, one that silenced many of the doubters within the tribe. On the settler side, Mrs. Patterson organized a group of women to help Nasha prepare for the baby. They brought fabric for baby clothes, offered advice on childbirth, and started planning a celebration for when the child arrived. Not all the settler women participated, but enough did to show that acceptance was growing. Spring came, bringing new life to the land and new hope to the territory. The raids had slowed considerably. Nako and his warriors were still out there, still occasionally stealing horses, but the violence had decreased. Some said it was because of the military presence. Others said it was because even the angry young warriors were starting to see that their cause was hopeless. The truth was more complex. Nasha had kept trying to reach her cousin through intermediaries, sending messages through Apache families who still had contact with the raiders. She told Nako about the baby, about his cousin who would be born soon. She reminded him that violence had never created life, only destroyed it. She asked him to think about what kind of world he wanted for the next generation. James worked the settler side, organizing meetings between ranchers and Apache representatives. They created a trading system that was fair to both sides, set up agreements about land use and water rights, established protocols for handling disputes without violence. It was slow, tedious work, but it was working. In May of 1889, Nasha went into labor. It was a difficult birth, lasting nearly 20 hours. James paced outside while Apache women who delivered countless babies worked with Mrs. Patterson and the town doctor. The combination of traditional Apache birthing practices and settler medical knowledge created an unlikely but effective team. When James finally heard the baby's cry, he nearly collapsed with relief. The Apache midwife emerged with a smile and told him he had a daughter. A beautiful, healthy daughter with her mother's dark eyes and what looked like it would be her father's lighter hair. James rushed inside to find Nasha exhausted but glowing, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket that Mrs. Patterson had made. They named her carefully, honoring both cultures. In English, she would be called Ruth, a strong biblical name that James's mother had loved. In Apache, she would be called Keona, meaning brown hills after the landscape they all loved. Ruth Keona McCarthy, a child of two worlds. Chief Goyathle arrived the next day to perform a traditional Apache blessing for the baby. He painted symbols on her forehead with sacred clay, sang songs that had been sung for Apache children for generations, and officially welcomed her into the tribe. Then the minister from town came and performed a Christian baptism. Ruth Keona was blessed by both faiths, claimed by both peoples. The celebration that followed was unlike anything the territory had ever seen. Apache families brought traditional foods and gifts. Settler families brought pies and blankets and hand-carved toys. The two groups mixed more freely than they ever had before, united in their joy over this new life. James watched as old Tom Bradley, who'd once written him off as a fool, awkwardly held baby Ruth and made silly faces to make her stop crying. He saw Nako standing at the edge of the gathering, not joining in but not leaving either, watching his young cousin with an expression James couldn't quite read. After most guests had left and the sun was setting, Nako finally approached. He didn't speak to James, but he spoke quietly to Nasha in Apache. James couldn't hear all the words, but he saw Nako gently touch the baby's head, a gesture of blessing. Then the young warrior said something that made Nasha's eyes fill with tears. Later, she told James what Nako had said. He'd told her that he was tired of fighting, tired of being angry all the time. He said that looking at baby Ruth, he couldn't see an enemy or a symbol. He just saw an innocent child who deserved a chance to grow up in peace. He said he couldn't speak for the other warriors, but he was done with the raids. He was ready to try Nasha's way, to see if peace was really possible. It wasn't an instant transformation. Nako and the other young warriors didn't immediately become peaceful farmers. But the raid stopped. Slowly, carefully, the young men started attending the meetings that James had organized. They started participating in the trading system. They started seeing settlers as individual people rather than just enemies. The military eventually withdrew, seeing that the immediate crisis had passed. Some soldiers grumbled that they'd been called out for nothing, but the smart ones recognized that a war had been prevented. That was always better than a war that had to be won. Over the next year, the McCarthy Ranch continued to thrive. James and Nasha added a room to the house for Ruth. They built a small trading post on their property, where Apache and settlers could exchange goods fairly. With James and Nasha acting as honest brokers to ensure no one was cheated, the trading post became something more than just a business. It became a gathering place, a neutral ground where people from both communities would stop to talk, to share news, to slowly build relationships. Friendships formed between people who would never have spoken to each other before. Not everyone came around. There were still settlers who refused to trust any Apache, still Apache who saw the peace as a betrayal, but they were becoming the minority rather than the majority. The majority were tired of fear and violence, ready to try something different. Chief Goyathle lived to see his granddaughter's first birthday. He held Ruth on his lap during the celebration, teaching her Apache words even though she was too young to repeat them. He told James and Nasha that they'd accomplished something he'd never thought possible. They'd proven that peace wasn't just a dream, It was achievable if people had the courage to work for it.